Lara Parker had never been the kind of person to believe in urban legends. She'd grown up in the quiet suburbs of Wisconsin, far away from the superstitions of big cities. Moving to Chicago had been a thrill for her, a fresh start, a new school, and the kind of independence she'd craved her whole life. Her apartment was on the top floor of an old brick building, one of those relics from the 1930s that seemed to carry the weight of the decades in its creaking walls and narrow hallways. To her, it was a dream, affordable, close to campus, and full of character. But the building wasn't without its quirks. From the moment she moved in, she noticed how the residents seemed to avoid the fire escape at the end of the hall. It wasn't just an unspoken rule. People actually went out of their way to warn her about it. "Don't use the fire escape at night," Mrs. O'Leary, the old lady from the third floor, had told her with a grave look. Lara had laughed it off, thinking it was just one of those local superstitions meant to scare newcomers. An old building like this was bound to have its share of ghost stories. The first few weeks went by in a blur. Classes, assignments, new faces. Everything was moving fast. She barely had time to settle in properly before the rhythm of her new life took over. But in the stillness of the night, when the world outside her window quieted down, Lara started to notice things. The sound of the city never truly faded, but beneath it, there was something else. A faint metallic creaking, like the groan of old metal under strain. She chalked it up to the wind, or maybe just the natural settling of the building. Chicago's infamous winds could do that, especially in autumn, when the chill would slice through the streets and howl between the alleyways. One night, after a particularly long study session, Lara was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep when she heard it again, the soft, rhythmic creak of metal shifting under weight. She turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around her. It was nothing, she told herself, just the wind playing tricks, but it was hard to ignore how precise the sound was, almost like footsteps. The next morning, Lara bumped into Mr. Grayson, a retired teacher who lived on the first floor. He was an old man, hunched and slow, but sharp, always had a story or two to tell. As they rode the elevator together, she casually mentioned the noises she'd been hearing. "That fire escape," Grayson muttered under his breath. His voice dropped, almost conspiratorial. "You stay away from that thing, especially after dark. No good comes from it." Lara raised an eyebrow. "What's the deal with it? Some kind of urban myth?" Grayson looked at her, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. "Let's just say people who use that fire escape at night. They don't always come back. Best to stay inside when you hear those creaks." His words were unsettling, but Lara still didn't buy into it. She thanked him for the advice and went about her day, but the conversation lingered in the back of her mind. That evening, as she sat at her desk, the sun setting behind the skyline, the thought of the fire escape gnawed at her. From her window, she could see it, the rusted, narrow staircase that twisted its way down the side of the building. The paint was chipped, the metal a dull red from years of exposure. It looked sturdy enough, despite the warnings. The noises came again that night, a little louder this time. Footsteps. She was sure of it now. Slow, deliberate, like someone was carefully making their way up the steps, pausing on each one. Lara sat up in bed, her heart thudding in her chest. She listened, breathless, as the sound moved closer, floor by floor. She counted them in her head, picturing the layout of the building. It was moving steadily upward, toward her floor. She got out of bed, her bare feet pressing into the cold wood of the floor. For a moment, she stood there, listening. Then, in one swift movement, she crossed the room and pulled back the heavy curtains from her window. Nothing. The fire escape was empty, just a skeletal structure swaying slightly in the wind. Lara exhaled, laughing at herself for being so paranoid. It had to be a trick of the mind, exhaustion playing games with her senses. She closed the curtains, climbed back into bed, and tried to convince herself that it was over. But it wasn't. The next night, the creaking returned, right on time, just as the clock ticked past 2 a.m. This time, it was louder, more distinct, as if someone was walking directly beneath her window. She forced herself to ignore it, pulling the blanket over her head and squeezing her eyes shut. Sleep didn't come easily. By the fourth night, Lara couldn't take it anymore. The sound was driving her insane, and she needed to know what was going on. She grabbed her phone and a small flashlight from her desk drawer. If this was just another tenant sneaking around the fire escape, she was going to get to the bottom of it. She unlocked her window and, hesitating for just a moment, pushed it open. A rush of cold air flooded the room, and for a second, she stood there, her flashlight flickering against the night. Slowly, cautiously, she leaned out of the window, peering down the narrow rusted staircase. At first, everything seemed normal. Just the rattle of the wind against the metal, the faint sounds of the city below. But then, her light caught something, a flicker of movement just a few floors down. Lara squinted, her breath catching in her throat as she focused on the spot. There, standing perfectly still in the shadows, was a figure, pale, almost translucent. It clung to the side of the building, its head tilted up toward her. Lara's heart stuttered in her chest. The thing wasn't moving, but it was watching her. Its eyes, if those dark voids could even be called eyes, were fixed on her, and its neck seemed too long, stretched unnaturally as it craned upward. Her mouth went dry. She took a step back, her hand trembling as she fumbled with the window latch. But before she could close it, the figure moved. It began to climb. Lara slammed the window shut, her breath ragged, heart thudding so loud she thought it might burst from her chest. The image of that grotesque figure still lingered in her mind. Its long neck, the blank eyes, the way it had just stood there, watching her, waiting. And then, the movement, slow, deliberate, as it began to climb. She locked the window and backed away, her hands shaking, the flashlight still in her grip. What the hell had she just seen? For hours, she couldn't stop pacing the room, replaying the moment in her mind over and over. Her rational brain tried to find an explanation, but there wasn't one. A trick of the light, a weird shadow. A stray thought wormed its way in. What if it wasn't her imagination? What if the stories about the fire escape were true? By the time the sun broke through the curtains, Lara felt exhausted, her body heavy with fatigue, but her mind still racing. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, but who? She hardly knew anyone in the building, and the idea of explaining what she had seen felt ridiculous, even to herself. Who would believe her? An apartment building ghost story. She could already imagine the look she'd get. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the sleepless nights, the stress from school, the loneliness, they were all playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong. That afternoon, as she walked through the lobby, she ran into Mrs. O'Leary again, the elderly neighbor from downstairs. She was carrying a bag of groceries, struggling to juggle her keys in the paper bag. Lara rushed over to help her, grateful for the distraction. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. O'Leary smiled weakly, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "These old bones don't move like they used to." Lara nodded, helping her to her door. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and dust, a strange combination of comfort and decay. She hesitated, unsure of how to bring it up, but the words slipped out before she could stop herself. "Mrs. O'Leary, what's the deal with the fire escape?" The old woman froze, her frail hand still clutching her keys. Her eyes flickered up to Lara's face, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no warmth in her expression. She looked afraid. "Why do you ask?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I just heard some noises the other night," Lara stammered, feeling ridiculous. "Probably nothing, but I thought I saw something. Someone. On the fire escape." Mrs. O'Leary's face drained of color. She placed the keys on the table and slowly sat down, as if the weight of the conversation was too much to bear. Lara stood awkwardly by the door, unsure whether she should apologize or press on. "Listen, dear," the woman began, her voice thin. "There are things in this building that you don't understand, that none of us do. We try to live with it, ignore it, but that fire escape, it's not safe. Not at night." She shook her head. "You'd do well to stay away from it." Lara felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. "Why? What is it?" Mrs. O'Leary looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide how much to say. Finally, she sighed. "This building..."
"It's old. Too old.
People come and go, but some of them, she hesitated, some of them don't. They disappear, always at night, always near the air's gate. Lara's mouth went dry. Disappear? What do you mean? She reached for a glass of water on the table.
Back in there was a young... nice folks. Then one night, the wife went out to check the fire escape.
Just to see if there was something wrong with it. People said they heard noises, like you did. Mrs. O'Leary's voice dropped, barely audible now. She never came back. Her husband said she was just gone, like she'd vanished into thin air. Lara stared at her, heart pounding in her chest. What happened to the husband? He moved out the next week, Mrs. O'Leary whispered. Said he couldn't live there anymore. The building tried to cover it up, said she ran off. But everyone knew, and she wasn't the only one. Lara felt a chill settle into her bones. She thanked the old woman and left, her mind spinning. Disappearances, people vanishing from the fire escape. It sounded insane. But the memory of the thing she had seen, the long twisted neck, the way it had climbed so slowly, was too vivid to be just a dream. That night, Lara lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building. Every creak, every gust of wind made her heart race. And then, just past 2 a.m., it started again. The soft, rhythmic creak of footsteps on the fire escape. She squeezed her eyes shut, telling herself not to look. Not again. She wouldn't do it. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed like whoever, or whatever, was right outside her window. Lara sat up, pulse pounding in her ears. She threw the blankets off and marched to the window, her hands trembling. She wouldn't let it scare her. She wouldn't let it take control. With one swift motion, she yanked the curtains open. The fire escape was empty, just a rusted old structure swaying in the wind. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But then, she saw it. A smear, just beneath her window. A dark, oily streak on the metal, like something had dragged itself across the bars. Her stomach twisted. She knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been there was real, and it had been close. Lara didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she made her way to the local library, her eyes red from exhaustion. She spent hours scrolling through microfilm, digging up old articles, anything she could find about her building. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual permits and renovations. But then, she found it. A newspaper clipping from 1952. Young woman disappears from fire escape in downtown apartment. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the details. The article was brief, dismissive, but it matched exactly what Mrs. O'Leary had said. The woman, Sarah Donnelly, had been last seen heading out to the fire escape to check on a noise. She was never seen again. The authorities had no leads, no signs of foul play, and the case went cold.
Lara leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. It wasn't just a ghost story. They had all lived in her apartment. She felt a cold sweat break out across her skin as she continued digging. There were more over the years.
Every few decades, another resident would vanish without a trace. The stories were always the same. Someone hears noises and investigates the fire escape, and then gone. She couldn't stop now. She had to know more.
Lara searched the city archives, combing through old police reports and city records. What she found only deepened the mystery. The building's original plans didn't even include a fire escape. It had been added sometime in the 1940s, but no one knew why. There were no permits, no official documentation. It was as if the structure had just appeared one day. Back in her apartment, Lara pored over the information she'd gathered, her mind racing. None of it made sense. How could a fire escape just appear? And what had happened to the people who disappeared? The creaking sound came again that night, but this time, it started earlier, just after midnight. Lara stood by the window, frozen in place, listening as the sound echoed through the night. She knew she should walk away, go back to bed, pretend it wasn't happening. But she couldn't. She reached for her phone, dialing the number of the building's super, Greg. He was a gruff man in his late 50s, always grumbling about broken pipes and leaky ceilings, but he was her only hope for answers. Greg answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah. Greg, it's Lara from 6B. I need to ask you about the fire escape," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. There was a long pause. What about it? I've been hearing noises, and I think someone's been on it. At night. Another pause. Longer this time. When Greg spoke again, his voice was low, almost a growl. Stay away from that thing. You hear me? Don't go out there. Don't even look at it. Lara's skin prickled. Why? What's going on? I don't know what it is, he said. But I've been working in this building for over 20 years, and I've seen enough to know better. People disappear, and it's always the ones who go messing around with that fire escape. Lara felt the air leave her lungs. She wanted to ask more, but Greg hung up before she could. She stared at her phone, her heart racing. Even the building super knew something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed, she kept the curtains drawn tightly closed, but the sound of the creaking metal haunted her. She couldn't escape it. Lara couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening on that fire escape was real. She had spent days going through the archives, combing through the stories, hearing the warnings, but none of it explained what she had seen. The figure on the stairs, the oily smear on the metal, the vanishing tenants. It wasn't just superstition. People were disappearing. Each night, the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if the thing out there knew she was paying attention. It knew she was afraid. She barely slept anymore. Her mind consumed with the dread of what might happen if she didn't figure this out. Every time she lay down, she could hear it, the soft creak of metal, the slow, deliberate ascent. It was always climbing, always getting closer. The next night, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the window, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had thought about calling the police, but what would she tell them? There was someone, or something, on her fire escape. They'd dismiss it as the ramblings of an overworked, paranoid student, but she wasn't crazy. She couldn't be. Lara knew she needed answers. Real answers. If she didn't find out what was going on, she would be next. There was no doubt in her mind now. Whatever that thing was, it was coming for her. She could feel it, lurking just outside the thin glass of her window, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a little past midnight when the first creak came. The sound sent a chill down her spine, and she froze, listening as it echoed through the stillness of the night. Slowly, she got to her feet, her body tense. Her heart raced, pounding so loudly in her ears that it almost drowned out the noise. Almost. The creaking continued, floor by floor, closer and closer. She stepped toward the window, careful to stay out of sight as she peered through the small gap in the curtains, her breath caught in her throat. There it was again. The figure, pale, hunched, crawling up the fire escape, its long neck stretching grotesquely upward as it climbed. The thing's limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, and the way it moved made her stomach churn. It was jerky, unnatural, as if its joints bent the wrong way, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Lara's fingers tightened around her phone. Her pulse quickened as she watched it draw closer, the metal stairs groaning under its weight. It was almost at her floor now, almost at her window. Panic gripped her. She stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. She couldn't just stand here and wait for it. She had to do something. She had to stop it. But how? How do you fight something like that? Something that shouldn't even exist? Her eyes darted to the door. If she ran now, maybe she could make it to the stairs, get out of the building before the thing reached her. But what if it followed her? What if it wasn't just the fire escape it haunted, but her? The creaking stopped. Lara froze, her breath shallow, barely daring to move. Had it reached her window? Was it out there now, staring in at her, waiting for her to come closer? She couldn't bring herself to look. She couldn't bear to see that face again, twisted and wrong, those empty eyes fixed on her. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then, the sound came again, but this time it wasn't the creak of metal. It was something else. A knock. Soft, almost tentative, but unmistakable. A knock on her window. Lara's blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, her legs trembling as she felt the wall press up against her. The knock came again, a little louder this time. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to convince herself that it wasn't real, that this was just some horrible nightmare. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more insistent, louder and faster, until it became a rapid, frantic pounding, like something, was desperate to get in. Lara's eyes flew open. She had to get out. Now. She grabbed her jacket, her phone, and bolted for the door, flinging it open just as the pounding stopped. She didn't dare look back. She ran down the hallway, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The hallway felt longer than usual, stretching on endlessly as her footsteps echoed off the walls. She could feel it behind her, even though she couldn't see it, that horrible presence, like a shadow creeping at the edges of her vision. She had to get out. She reached the stairwell, her hand shaking as she gripped the cold metal railing and stumbled down the steps. The air was thick with dust, the dim overhead lights flickering weakly as she descended, floor by floor. But the deeper she went, the stronger the feeling became, that suffocating, all-encompassing sense that something was chasing her. It was close now, so close she could feel it. The weight of its gaze, the way the darkness seemed to bend around it, swallowing everything in its path. Lara burst through the door to the lobby, her breath ragged, her legs aching. She raced across the room, throwing open the door and stepping out into the cold night air. For a moment, she stood there, gasping for breath, her eyes scanning the empty street. There was no sign of it, but she knew it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go back to that apartment. Whatever that thing was, it wouldn't stop until it got her. It was only a matter of time. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing against the pavement as she fled down the street, away from the building, away from the fire escape. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get as far away as possible. Hours passed, maybe more. By the time she stopped running, she found herself in a part of the city she didn't recognize. The towering skyscrapers of downtown replaced by old, crumbling buildings and dark alleyways. The streets were empty, the air heavy with silence. Lara collapsed onto a bench, her body trembling from exhaustion. She pulled out her phone, but the screen was cracked, the battery nearly dead. There was no one she could call, no one who would believe her. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her mind a blur of fear and confusion. But as the night wore on, a terrible realization began to sink in. It wasn't over. She could still feel it. That presence, lingering just beyond the edge of her perception, watching, waiting. It wasn't tied to the fire escape. It was tied to her. No matter where she went, it would follow. Lara's breath hitched as she looked around, her eyes darting to every shadow, every darkened corner. The city felt foreign, alien, like a maze she couldn't escape. And in the back of her mind, she could hear it again. That same slow, deliberate creak. Her hands shook as she got to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. It was out there, somewhere, climbing. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, the streetlight above her flickered and went out. The darkness closed in, suffocating and thick, and then she heard it. Footsteps. Not the creak of metal this time, but something heavier, something closer. She spun around, her eyes wide, but there was nothing there, just an empty street. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and steady, echoing through the silence. Lara backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She had to keep moving. She had to stay ahead of it, but the footsteps grew louder, faster, until they were all around her, surrounding her. She couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. It was like the darkness itself was alive, closing in on her, trapping her. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was the same thing she had seen on the fire escape, its pale, twisted form now fully revealed in the dim light. Its neck still stretched unnaturally long, its eyes hollow and black, staring right at her. Lara's scream caught in her throat as it reached out, its long fingers curling toward her. She stumbled backward, her body trembling with fear, but there was nowhere to go. The figure moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. Lara turned and ran,